When I was in the 8th grade, I tried to build a maglev train. As you may know, that stands for magnetic levitation. And it's a train that runs suspended on magnets, so there's no friction, which means it's incredibly energy efficient. They have these in various countries in the world, and we've been trying to build one in the United States since well before the mid-'80s when I tried to build my train. I would go down to the main branch of the New York Public Library, you know, the one with the lions out front. And for me, since I lived above 96th Street, as it was called at the time, this was a journey into the darkest depths of the city. And then I'd go further down into what in my recollection is this cavernous basement where I read heavy hardbound books with green covers and looked at the technical drawings of the various approaches to magnetic levitation. And armed with these, I went with my mother to the hardware store and bought some magnets and some wood and proceeded to construct my train. The train never worked. Of course, major infrastructure projects, even in miniature, don't submit that easily to the efforts of nerdy junior high school students from the now long since gentrified hood. But I entered the train in the science fair project that year. And the judges and my teacher kept a straight face as I walked up to the front of the room with my obsessions and my ideas and my little engine that definitely could not. And they proceeded to award me 3rd place for my mistakes. They valued my obsession and my attempts. Now, I think all the time about the distance that separates a kid and her ideas and her obsessions from the access she needs to gain the experience to make those ideas real. Sujata Mitra talks about 2 kinds of remoteness: the remoteness of a village in rural India and the remoteness of an urban slum. Well, this afternoon, I'd like to focus on a 3rd type of remoteness, and that is the distance between the ideas that a kid has and the access she needs to learn to make those ideas real. Now, in the startup world, the importance of failure is a commonplace. Fail fast is practically a mantra in Silicon Valley. And in the world of social ventures and nonprofits, the idea of expanding access to opportunity is talked about all the time. But what we hear much less about is the importance of expanding access to the opportunity to fail. We hear much less about the narrowing of opportunities to try and fail and learn to use one's powers. Though ironically, the stories that nerdy kids love are all about this. Let me get a quick show of hands. Who grew up on Harry Potter? The world grew up on Harry Potter. All right. What about Katniss Everdeen? Any fans of the Hunger Games in the house? There's like 4. I remember being an early adopter, this isn't really part of my talk, of the Hunger Games, and going to a Borders where I asked everyone where this book was. And it just wasn't in fiction until finally someone who worked there said, there's a section called YA. But how about, just go old school for a second, how about Luke Skywalker? Any fans of Luke? All right, good. And who thinks that all of these stories are pretty lame? All right, this is going to be good because this is a room of nerds. Each of these stories, and the superhero story of your choice, is about a kid who's stuck in an incredibly remote place and needs to get access to a set of experience where she learns to use her power. Now, nerdy kids love these stories because learning to use your power or magic is a metaphor for learning to make ideas real. You heard it here, Harry Potter is an entrepreneur. Now, at not the highest point in his career, not Harry Potter, but Steve Jobs had just been fired from Apple. And you can find this really lo-fi video online where Jobs talks about the most important thing. The most important thing, he says, is the moment when you realize that everything around you that you call life was made up by people no smarter than you are, and you can change it. Everything around you that you call life was made up by people no smarter than you are, and you can change it. And Jobs and the others who created the basis for the digital age really did save, well, if not the world, then at least the US economy. Jim Clifton, in his book, The Coming Jobs War, Jim Clifton is the head of Gallup, argues that at a time when I was making that little train and there was a widespread perception of economic decline, it was those who created the digital age that gave us decades of economic growth. So this should be good news, right? Because we're in a golden age of entrepreneurship. My grandmother, who's 101, talks about Shark Tank, and I can't turn around without being pitched by a kid on her new app. But the data tell us that this is more like celebrating during the decline. Because entrepreneurship is on the wane in America, and it's waning particularly amongst the young. The average business economy-wide is getting older, so that, as John Lettieri testified to the Senate last year, startups as a percentage of total business have been dropping since the 70s till it's about half the level that it was now. If you've read that Forbes article that says entrepreneurship's on the rise, it's important to read the fine print, because that article was based on interviews with high net worth and ultra high net worth individuals. In English, the rich and the filthy rich. And this is the problem, because if entrepreneurship and the ability to take your ideas and turn them into life becomes a privilege, just restricted to the usual suspect, just for those already in the club, then we're just going to keep solving the same kinds of problems we've already solved. And I really will have to keep hearing one more slightly different social network or sharing economy application. If entrepreneurship becomes a luxury, then the observation of James G. Marsh, the organizational theorist, will come true, where he says, homogeneous groups are very good at doing what they already do well, but progressively less able to investigate alternatives. And we're making this worse today. There are people in power today in this country and elsewhere in the world who are threatened by the capacity to make ideas real. These are the kinds of people that couldn't create a digit of the digital age and whose idea of innovation is to defraud students at a fake university or shaft as many small business people as they can get away with. These are people who are threatened by making ideas real. And the kinds of policies they create would keep today Steve Jobs' father, who was here from Syria, from being in this country, so that an innovator like that would never be born. Talk about the Lord Voldemort plan. But it's not about those in power so much as the impetus that got them there. Build a wall, and every incarnation of it around the world is the wimpiest idea there is, because it is the principle of keeping the field to yourself, because you're threatened by making ideas real. And build a wall leads us to a future where we're fighting over pieces of the world that was made yesterday. Now, being good science fiction nerds, and I realize that's 100% in this room, I counted. We have a data scientist in the room who's working on that right now. Being good science fiction nerds, we're interested in an alternative future, aren't we? So how do we switch from that apocalyptic future and get the alternative? Well, I believe that the stories nerdy kids love provide an answer. So let's start with Luke Skywalker, because that's the one I grew up on. Luke is living in a place that's as remote as it gets. He lives on a desert planet in the far side of the galaxy. And Luke, before he can become a Jedi Knight, needs to learn 3 things. All right, I'm going to ask the audience. Do you know what they are? Think about it for a second. All right, let me give you a cheat on that and see if you agree. The first thing Luke needs to learn is that he has the force within him, because he doesn't know that. So the first thing he needs is knowledge of his power. But that's not good enough. The next thing he needs to do in the second movie that comes out is he needs to go to a place where he can try to use the force and make all kinds of mistakes. And notwithstanding Yoda's injunction that there is no try, he has to try and fail until he learns to harness and focus his power. But that's not enough either. The third thing that Luke needs to do is get access to an ecosystem of people and infrastructure that can help him bring his power to the galaxy, which is the Rebel Alliance. So Luke needs knowledge of the force, he needs a space to make mistakes and learn to focus his power, and he needs the Rebel Alliance. Now, the same thing goes for Harry. Harry Potter, well, he needs to know about the wizarding world. He needs to know he's a wizard. He needs knowledge of his power. Then he needs a space. He needs to go off to Hogwarts and sneak off to the Forbidden Forest and go through all kinds of mishaps as he learns to master and focus his power. And thirdly, Harry needs not just Ron and Hermione, but Dumbledore's army. Harry needs an alliance to bring his power to the wizarding world. Knowledge of your power, a space where you can make mistakes and learn to harness that power, and an alliance. Gandhi is often quoted, and I don't think you can actually find proof that he said this, but he's often quoted as saying that you know a lot about a civilization by the way it treats its animals. Well, I believe that in today's world, you know a great deal about a society by the way it uses its nerds. And I was lucky because I had experiences like being able to build that train that didn't work and being encouraged. And then later, during the Great Recession of 2008 and 9, my first business failed. And I might not have told you this at the time, but that was the single best experience I've ever had in terms of learning to harness and focus my powers. But the access to that experience of trying and failing is narrowing. One of my own students at Baruch, where I teach a course in digital innovation, wrote a comment on an article I had published. And she said, "Professor, you forgot the most important thing. We can't afford to fail." This kid, an immigrant, who had fought her way to getting straight A's at the best public business school in our area, all due respect to Stern, this kid felt that she had zero access to opportunities to try and fail. We here in this room must prevent a lost generation of entrepreneurs. My team is doing experiments right now with the knowledge, the space, and the alliance. Last year, we brought entrepreneurs into an inner city school and high school where they spoke with high school students about their ideas for how to improve the world and what to create. And I've since been told by teachers in that program that those kids found their power to do so, some of them. Next month, we're releasing a new framework for the Global Center for Youth Employment. We've been funded to create a framework to help kids in the developing world have opportunities to try to make their ideas real and a space where they can try and fail. And then in June, we're pitching a new mobile platform that helps give those kids access to an ecosystem and a set of infrastructure opportunities and that alliance that they need. And that is aptly called Rebelbase. But it's not my experiments that matter here. Here at NYU, where we held our venture and social venture competitions yesterday, which I've judged for years, and where we have a brand new innovation lab, what I want to know is what are the experiments that you can run so that it is not just the most privileged and those who share a frame of reference who have opportunities to make their solutions real. Because if we don't, the alternative is that future where we're fighting and grasping for pieces of the world that was made yesterday to quote one more kids nerd series, indeed today the dark is rising, and it is tempting to look to the big people to save us from this, to look to the RRs and to look to the men of Gondor. But those with solutions are stuck on Privet Drive with the Dursleys, or in District 12, or on Tatooine. And they have the magic within them to remake the world if we give them half the chance to learn to use it. What are we going to do for them? Thank you.